Hello and welcome to the Fully Charged Plus podcast. My name is Robert Llewellyn and I'd just like to start by reminding myself and you lovely listeners a tiny bit of background on the series and why we bother making it. Now this podcast itself has only been going for about 3 years or so, but our main show on YouTube is rapidly heading for its 12th birthday. 12 years. Now, in that 12 years, we've seen some truly momentous changes in the transport and energy sector. So amazingly encouraging things. And of course, some absolutely huge setbacks and total flops and disasters. But what is clear now is that the technology that inspired this whole endeavor, essentially the electric car, has finally taken a huge step forward. The arguments about the necessities to stop burning fossil fuels have all been won. Anyone who argues otherwise is now fighting a losing battle, and that includes the fossil fuel industry themselves, and they know it. As we'll hear in this episode, the arguments are shifting, but generally they're shifting in a good or positive way. So the discussion now within the Fully Charged show is not trying to convince people that electric cars are better. There's no need. They are better. But now we need to look at the bigger picture of how this technology can fit into our lives and benefit the largest number of people. How things like the car ownership model that we currently employ with cars, which, in the grand scheme of things, isn't very sustainable. How do we adjust to dealing with that, to, not maybe owning cars outright, but sharing them in some way? How can we make non-car transportation more attractive, more affordable, safer, really importantly, and more commonplace? And I'm talking here walking, cycling, public transport, obviously, those things really, particularly for cities. Absolutely vitally important. Just wanted to do a little sidebar here because we've had some peculiar weather in the UK recently. We've had some bright sunshine, very cold weather, but bright sunshine. And all the air quality indicators in London went off the scale. So toxic, so bad. Still, 2021, people who live in London are still suffering from chronic low air quality. Really, really high levels of PM 2.5s, top of NOx and SOx. Basically, why? Because we're still running diesel engines. And, the air has been still, and it's a particular atmospheric conditions do this. It's just an absolute disgrace. The authorities in London were suggesting to people not to exercise because it's dangerous. Stay indoors as long as you can. That is a massive travesty that is still going on. So I think in the coming year, we're going to see, of course, a load more new electric cars coming to the market. Some really exciting ones, some a little bit predictable. And we will be right at the forefront in reporting on them on the Fully Charged show. But also there's amazing breakthroughs in renewable energy systems, energy storage, smart grids, electric flight, electric shipping. We're going to be covering all those. There are huge challenges, but as we keep trying to illustrate, there are huge opportunities too. And this podcast, as regular listeners will know, very often involves a guest who is in some way connected with the changes we're seeing all around us in the fields of energy or transport. But today, I'm all alone, a sad old man sitting in front of a microphone talking into the void. So this is a solo podcast where I will have what is sometimes referred to as a deep dive into a small handful of topics. But before I start, I wanted to remind you, lovely listeners, something you will be constantly reminded of on every long-running podcast you listen to. And that is, here's a difference. We're not sponsored by Squarespace. So that really sets us apart. We've got nothing to do with Squarespace at all. And we don't even use Squarespace anymore. I did use it for a while. I thought it was good. Not denigrating Squarespace. We just don't have anything to do with it. And every podcast I listen to is brought to you by Squarespace. Anyway, we've got nothing to do with Squarespace. We've got our own very special, very specific sponsors. I'll get to them in a minute. But what we would love you to do is subscribe to this series on your podcast download app or on YouTube, on the Fully Charged Plus YouTube channel. And also, if you're feeling the need for further commitment, we have facilitated an avenue for your kind and generous support on our Patreon page. And that's over on patreon.com/Fully Charged Show. All in one word. Fully Charged Show. All links to these and our sponsors are in the show notes or description box, as always. And now I've mentioned our sponsor twice. It would be remiss of me not to introduce a message from the lovely folks who are doing such amazing work over at My Energy. My Energy is putting the I back into British innovation. My Energy is putting the I back into inventing the future. My Energy is putting the I back into inspiring a nation. Recharging the world with green, smart energy. Charge your EV with your PV and more. Visit myenergy.com and help to spark the green revolution. My Energy, driving the charge to a greener future. There we go. That's the little intro all done and dusted. Put that back on the shelf and let's spread out some nice fresh topics for your enjoyment. So I want to start on a few upbeat stories and also reflect on the fact that some of the daft concepts and ideas I've seen in the last 12 years might still, totally unpredictably, actually come to fruition. And some just come out of left field when you least expect it. Now, a couple of years ago, there was much talk about Dyson, the Dyson company making an electric car. Now, I once met a Dyson engineer at an event to launch the Jaguar I-Pace. And this engineer was, I'm going to put this in the most polite terms possible, a little bit relaxed. The Jaguar PR team were busy plying journalists with wine. I didn't drink any. I just had water. I'm boring. It was in the daytime. I would have collapsed in a heap if I'd done it, but this gentleman really wasn't holding back. He was very happy to drink the wine. So this slightly inebriated engineer who worked at Dyson explained that they were developing an electric car with a 350-mile range, solid-state batteries, 20-year battery life, and could deal with 10,000 plus charge cycles, blah-de-blah-de-blah, truly game-changing claims. And he kept saying, I haven't sold you this. I haven't said anything about this. It's got a 350-mile range. It's like a big Range Rover. I heard all this stuff. Anyway. So I was looking forward to seeing something emerge from the disused airfield in Wiltshire where the Dyson company were testing these vehicles. Cut forward to a few years later and it's not happening. Lord Sir James of the highly Dyson pulls the plug literally on the whole venture. He could not make it work. And he is not alone. We can make fun of that particular failure, but we have to accept that Dyson is an incredibly successful company in other areas. And they couldn't make an electric car work. And of course he's not alone. I mean, we had fun on the Fully Charged show a few years back talking about Faraday Future, or the Faraday Future's car. The claims the company made were jaw-dropping. It was going to be so amazing. It was going to be a Tesla killer. They ran huge launch events with hundreds of journalists there. I've not heard a peep about that company for 5 years. Gone. Lucid, I really hope they can make enough cars and actually sell them and make a lot more. I saw one in Los Angeles. They're amazing. They've got slightly more chance of getting there, I think, and it's a beautifully designed car. Bollinger, brilliant looking off-road truck. We saw it, we had an episode about it, saw it at the LA Motor Show. Amazing bit of inspired engineering. Now, they've just announced that they're not making it, they're delaying making it, making the Bollinger B1, which is the thing that looks a bit like an old Land Rover Defender. But they are instead focusing on producing commercial trucks. So they're still in business. They're not going out of business. They'll probably do very well with the commercial trucks, but they're not making the fabulous-looking Bollinger B1, which I would have been very tempted to get. Aptera, Californian automotive startup, brilliant-looking car, really innovative. We hope to be test driving one in the spring. They have been hanging around in the wings for a long time, but they have not gone away. Rivian do seem to have survived the startup hype and are now actually making cars. And everyone's test driving them, and we're really late to the party, but we will be test driving one in the spring. And of course, Tesla have now proven beyond all doubt that it is possible to start a new company in the 21st century and make it succeed to such an extent it has put pretty much all other car manufacturers on red alert. So those are all new startups, sometimes coming out of existing companies like Dyson, but mostly starting from scratch. And then we have Google and their self-driving technology, never really building cars, but sort of fiddling about with it on the edges, starting and stopping for over a decade, but clearly developing software that could enable smarter, more intelligent cars, maybe autonomous cars, all that sort of kind of gubbins. Then Apple, who have clearly invested many billions in developing electric cars and who may or may not ever make something that vaguely resembles a car. Or not. I admit I decided they would never make something that vaguely resembles a car a few years back, but now the rumours are rife. They are hiring people like it's going out of style. And that's the only clue we have. All we know is that Apple are very good at their Stalinist approach to secrecy. And the most recent that has caught my eye is Sony. They just revealed a couple of prototype electric cars at the recent Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Again, this could be a bit of marketing guff, a bit of greenwash, or it could be serious. What I feel confident in saying is I really think someone out of this crowd, maybe Apple, maybe Sony, maybe even Samsung, is going to successfully launch an electric car for real in the next couple of years. And I'm also thinking, because these people are brilliant at making stuff, but not Apple, because they quite like expensive things, but everyone else is quite good at driving down prices. And I just want to quickly remind listeners and myself that I'm talking about startup new or companies that are going into this space, not all the existing companies that are developing electric cars, some of which are incredible and some of which are less breathtaking. So this is particularly people outside the existing automotive industry. I am talking about existing companies that have made their mark in areas outside ground transport. And I've not even mentioned the myriad of Chinese startups. And then there's VinFast out of Vietnam. Seriously, people of my generation will find it very hard to grasp that it will soon be possible to buy a really smart looking and very impressive electric car that's made in Vietnam by a Vietnamese company. So what this boils down to is the immense challenge the existing big automotive companies are facing. The European and North American brands have, and in some cases the Japanese, dominated the world's car markets for the last 60 years and are teetering now on a knife edge. Yeah, they're still flogging diesel and petrol cars at the moment, but all the sales figures for those type of cars are down, and they're only going to go down further. And please don't just believe me when I say this. I recently spoke with Dr. Andy Palmer on the Fully Charged Plus podcast a couple of weeks ago. And Andy was second in command at Nissan when they launched the Nissan Leaf. And he now works for Switch Mobility, which is they make electric vans and buses. And it's really worth listening to him discuss the challenges facing established automakers. It's someone who really, really understands that, because that was his job for many, many years. How to transition a fossil fuel combustion car company into an electric car company. Anyway, next, energy storage. Now, clearly, this is a critically important aspect of transitioning off from fossil fuels. No one needed to store energy 10 years ago. We used fossil fuels as the store. If you had a load of massive oil tanks at your refinery or huge gas tanks, you knew you had a few months' supply. With renewables, that is no longer the case. You might be able to produce 20 times the electricity you need at any one time with renewables that we have now. And that number is only going to increase. This is the thing people don't realize. We often produce way more electricity than we can possibly use. And we're talking, we need to be able to store that power. It's a stupid waste of resources if you can't store that excess energy to use later. And we're talking about multiple terawatts. That's what we need to store, not a couple of kilowatt hours on the wall of my garage. Now, we have discussed the role of chemical batteries on the Fully Charged show many times, and flow batteries and second life batteries, and all those technologies have a massive role to play. But I can't help kind of liking the quirky ideas that come along. A long-time favourite of mine is Gravitricity, and you can find out more about them at gravitricity.com. Now, they are developing a system that uses old mine shafts into which they sling huge concrete weights suspended on massive steel ropes attached to huge electric motors / generators on the surface. So when electricity is cheap and very clean, they wind the weights up the mine shaft. And we're talking weights that weigh many, many hundreds of tons. They're massive. It's not like a bag of gravel. It's like massive weight, hundreds and hundreds of tons. And they pull that up this mine shaft. And mine shafts, got to remind you, are really, really deep. They're not like 20 foot deep. They're many hundreds of meters deep. When electricity is in demand and more expensive, you slowly lower the weights, driving the generators, which produces electricity. I love it. It's very simple. And if in this country in particular, in the United Kingdom, we have a huge supply of abandoned coal mine shafts all over the country. And recently announced at CES, again, is Ocean Grazer. They've invented an offshore energy storage system that sits at the bottom of the sea, basically on the seabed, all around where there are offshore wind turbines. That's the idea. Now, I've seen ideas along these lines before. The one I saw was a giant inflatable bladder being held down on the seabed by enormous weights, and you pump it full of air during cheap, abundant power generation. Now, the water pressure around the bladder means that when you want to extract the power, this high pressure air drives a turbine, which spins a generator, therefore getting electricity. It's clever, but it puts the components that make up this system under enormous stress. I mean, you can do it in a swimming pool with a football. If you try and hold a football down deep underwater, it really, really pushes up hard all the time. So to hold that air bubble down on the ground, you're holding down something that is by definition very, very buoyant. It requires vast amounts of materials. We're not talking something small, we're talking something truly huge. These bladders were the size of a big top circus tent. So I think there have been some small-scale developments with this type of tech, but nothing commercial has emerged yet. Well, now enter the team from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands who've come up with a rather clever spin on this idea. Same principle, great big bladders on the seabed. But these ones are long sausage bladders rather than big top tent bladders. So imagine a great big long sausage bladder on the seabed. But this time they're filled with fresh water. Ooh, clever. Water doesn't float on water, so you don't have to hold them down with 10 million tons of concrete. Here's how they could work. When offshore wind turbines are churning out power, but there's low demand onshore for all that electricity, the power will run huge pumps that pump fresh water from huge underground reservoirs and inflate the bladders that lie along the ocean bed. Yeah, the pumps and the reservoirs are literally buried in the seabed. How do you bury something huge under the seabed? I don't know. Don't ask awkward questions. But someone clever has clearly worked it out. And when you think of the amount of technology we've used to extract oil and gas from deep sea situations, digging a bit of a hole in the seabed and shoving a great big pump down it and a load of air storage containers, it's a doddle. That's a weekend's work. It's a hobby. Then when the wind dies down or there is high demand for electricity, the pressure on the bladders, which would be enormous amount of pressure on those bladders, that squeezes the water through a turbine, spinning a generator that is also buried under the seabed, and boom, you get power. I hope it doesn't go boom because water's leaked into it overnight. I'm sure they've worked that out. I hope someone makes this happen. It's very scalable, and if you installed a system like this, at the same time as you were installing a big wind farm, it would make a lot of sense for the economies of scale. You could do it much cheaper. And now, electric concrete. What? What did he say? Did he say electric concrete? Yes, I did. I said electric concrete. There is a very forward-thinking building company in Germany called Holcim. I don't know how you say it. Holcim. Holcim. And they have teamed up with the German startup company called Magment to, and I'm quoting off their website here, improve its magnetizable concrete technology for road surfaces, enabling electric vehicles to recharge wirelessly while in motion. Oh, come on, that's just silly. That'll never work. What you mean? You drive along in your electric car and it charges while you're driving? Give me a break. Okay, so quite a few years ago, I went to Paris and watched a Renault electric van drive along a strip of road at 70 kilometers an hour as it charged the battery at around 50 kilowatts. Yes, it was charging as it drove along. Now, it was driving over maybe 200, 250 meters of probably the most expensive road on earth, because buried in the middle of the road was a string of inductive charging plates. You can see the episode we made about this on the Fully Charged Show YouTube page. Anyway, technically, it worked, but the massive disruption and expense of installing something like this, it just meant it was never that likely to happen. But this idea, magnetic concrete that can hold an electric current that is then transferred to a vehicle as it passes above. Seriously? I like a good old quirky bit of technology, but this is right out there, isn't it? I think it is right out there, but clearly they are mucking around with this idea. They suggest it could also be used to charge batteries of autonomous robots that move supplies around big factories. Now, I've seen these little fellows in every car factory I've ever been to, and believe me, listeners, I've been to quite a few. That, I can see, could happen quite soon. Dedicated lanes which act as induction charging strips. But it'd be a lot easier than putting in induction charging plates with all the electronic wiring. You just run it through the concrete, literally through the concrete. There's no clever bits of metal there. I think it's going to be a while before we see a sign telling us that the inside lane is a recharge lane, maximum speed 60 miles an hour. That's a dream, isn't it? It'd be brilliant. You're driving on a long motorway journey and you pull onto the recharge lane, slow down a bit, top up the batteries, carry on. I got excited about it because I'm a sucker for such things. But if you scroll down the page announcing this breakthrough, there is a very big disclaimer section. I've posted all the links to all these stories in the show notes. But anyway, there's a disclaimer section. It's called Disclaimer. And again, I quote, this document, oh no, wait a minute, they're German, aren't they? Yeah, sorry. This document contains forward-looking statements. Such forward-looking statements do not constitute forecasts regarding results for any other performance indicator, but rather trends or targets, as the case may be, including with respect to plans, initiatives, events, products, solutions, and services, their development and potential. That sounds like it might have been written by someone whose job is the law, otherwise known as a lawyer. Okay, then. Well, regardless of that, in the fullness of time, things like induction charging, I think, will become commonplace. For example, you could just lay this magnetic concrete in car parking spaces. Then I think it could be a great benefit. Drive your car in, get out, lock your car, walk away. It's charging. You've done nothing. Bing! I've used induction charging plates. They're amazing. As long as you get the car in the right point, it just starts charging. And it's not slow, and the losses are not massive. Everyone goes, oh, the losses will be absolutely colossal. No, they're not. They're about the same as a copper cable. So, moving on. I'm about to get a bit moody and stroppy about the fossil fuel industry. But before I do, I just want to mention a couple of short stories. And for balance, I think it is a transition. We're going to see this transition repeated in the coming couple of years, a lot more. The first is just a little blip in the news, but worth mentioning. A recent report from the Reuters news agency, which I'm sure is just a cut and paste job from a PR handout, but the basis of the story is interesting because of where it comes from. BP, the company that once used the tagline, Beyond Petroleum, but then spent multiple billions developing new oil and gas fields. Anyway, them, you know who it is, BP. They've just announced that they can now see that rapid chargers are, and I quote, on the cusp, end quote, of being more profitable than their smelly old fossil fuel pumps. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you run a big fossil fuel forecourt. You are selling hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars or euros worth of fuel a year from that facility, but with a very small markup. But you have to maintain an enormous buried infrastructure of fuel storage, safe fuel storage on the site. You need a lot of electricity to run all those pumps. There's a lot of stuff that is buried under the ground at a refueling station. And yes, they do use a lot of electricity to pump and store and maintain that fuel. And you also need to keep those storage tanks topped up. And what do you need to do that? Well, you need heavy, huge diesel trucks hauling many tons of highly toxic, highly inflammable fossil fuel all over the country. So the safety equipment and the safety systems needed to do that without catastrophe all cost a great deal of money. Compare that with the initial expense of paying for and installing the charger, paying a member of staff to wipe it down a couple of times a week, and paying for the electricity, which, as an industrial user, will be at a much lower rate than we pay at home. People drive in, plug into it, pay way above the odds for the electricity they're taking, go into the store on the site, spend more money, and that is pure profit. Yes, it's partly greenwash, of course. They'll paint flowers on the floor where you charge the car. But the peculiar thing about this greenwashing is when it starts to make money, things change really fast. And I think this is a really good sign. And we are clearly going to be seeing a lot more chargers all over the world. Here's another example. And this one I think is it just backs up what I've just been saying. Last year, the global oil giant Shell, you've heard of them, closed a profitable fossil refueling forecourt in Fulham in West London. Profitable. Wasn't a rundown one in some unused area, right in the middle of a very, very affluent, wealthy area where there are mountains of Range Rovers that all use a lot of fossil fuel. They closed this one down. This week, it has reopened as a 100% electric charging forecourt. Now, I'm going to go there next week to have a little bit of a top-up and a little bit of a snoop around. I knew Shell were doing this, and I'm intrigued to see what it's like. Shell have been installing rapid chargers at some of the bigger fossil stations in the UK, but they generally install one, sometimes two chargers. Now, this newly opened site has 9 very fast rapid chargers. Okay, that's not a huge amount. There are other charging hubs with far more, but this is quite a small inner city site. It's not a really big it's right in the middle of London. And if you live in that area and you have no off-street parking, which virtually no one has in Fulham, and you have an electric car, and believe me, there are loads of them around. I mean, they're all parked in between Range Rovers and massive Mercedes and Audi SUVs, but they do exist and they are there. Well, then this service appearing on your doorstep is an absolute blessing. My experience with the Shell charges is that they are reliable, easy to use, and not the most expensive. So that's all good. I have come across one Shell recharge charger that didn't work, and that was really annoying. And I asked the people in the garage what was wrong with it, and they said they didn't know, but no one's come out to see it, but they hope they will. So that's happened. Not saying they're perfect, but generally speaking, I've used about 6 in the last 2 years on various occasions, and they've all worked except for that one. Okay, because Shell is investing far more in developing new oil and gas wells, you've got to keep the realistic view of it, but I'm trying to be balanced. They are doing something to promote electric vehicle use. So, moving on. One of the few advantages of being yet another dull old white bloke that talks too much is that if you hang around long enough, you see the rise and fall of fashions and trends and how they wax and wane over the decades. Now, I'd love to talk about flared trousers or miniskirts or platform shoes or jeans with ripped knees. I've seen all those things before. I've seen them come back. I've seen them fade away. You realize there's nothing new, but that's not what Fully Charged Plus podcast is about. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is one of the perennial solutions to burning fossil fuels we see coming back again and again at periods of, I'm saying, roughly 5 years. That seems to be the pattern. I don't mean the people who read about hydrogen, somebody who read about hydrogen in 2007 and still repeats ridiculous things like, I'm waiting for hydrogen to catch on, as if it's merely a case of it becoming fashionable. These comments are cut and pasted endlessly and remain a constant background noise in my life. Just annoying. But fine and understandable. And before I go further, I want to state very clearly that I think there are numerous vitally important sectors of a low to zero carbon future that will involve the use of hydrogen. It's going to be a critical element in many, many areas. We need it. I am not anti-hydrogen. That would be a most stupid thing to do. It's always, in this circumstance, a case of as well as, not instead of. Very important to make that point. It may one day even make sense to use hydrogen as a fuel for light passenger vehicles, but I fear that time is still a long, long way off. But I don't want to give the impression that I'm anti-hydrogen. Far from it. I want it to become a vital fuel in the future. Now, I have never changed my opinion on that. From way back before I started making this series, when I spent 2 years reading and researching all the alternatives to fossil fuel back in the late noughties. And the second car I ever drove on the Fully Charged show was the Honda Clarity, a hydrogen fuel cell car, right back in the day. So I have seen hydrogen touted as the be-all and end-all many, many times before, my entire life. The frantic pushing of hydrogen as the answer to all our problems has been a bit quiet for the last 4.5 years. There were a few press announcements, or indeed commentators that maybe have mentioned hydrogen. But in the last 18 months or so, hydrogen has indeed been in the news a great deal. And many influential politicians seem somehow to have been informed that this fascinating and very exciting technology is the future. So why has hydrogen risen its perfectly clean but still very small head again? Why, may I ask, have we not seen the promised 5 million hydrogen cars on the world's roads? Why has this technology stayed 15 years in the future since I was about 10 years old, which I will reveal is now 55 years ago? Constant promises of that. And, there are loads and loads of historical documents which absolutely guarantee there will be 5 million hydrogen fuel cell cars on the world's roads by 2020. It's now 2022. There's still nowhere near that many. I saw a black and white documentary film about hydrogen cars back in 1966. I can remember it well. I went to the cinema with my father, and there was a sort of Pathé black and white newsreel about Rover developing hydrogen cars. And the other thing I really want to understand is why the idea that why is the idea that hydrogen fuel cell cars, and this is very specific, why the notion of HFC cars appeals to a certain cohort of men? Now, seriously, I've never once heard a woman say to me, but what about hydrogen fuel cell cars, Robert? Never. It's always men. And why is that? And before you jump on any possible high moral horse and start rabid accusations, I do regularly get asked by women about electric cars. And when I say electric cars, I mean battery electric, of course. They don't care, and I don't blame them. And there's loads of women who really do understand the engineering. And they seem to understand that hydrogen possibly isn't the answer for small passenger cars. Women, it seems, are not that worried about charging electric cars because they don't have ego invested into either their driving abilities or the machismo of the journeys they do. Now, most of the women I talk to about this subject, and it's not like I talk to like crowds of women every day. I'm not trying to imply that, but the ones who can be bothered to listen to me for 10 minutes, well, there's one or two of them, they seem to easily understand that the vast majority of driving they do is well within the national average of under 35 miles a day. They're just not bothered about it. They're not instantly jumping on the fact that they're, once they get that, how far can the car go? 250 miles. Oh, right, boring. They're just not interested. But the men who still obsess about hydrogen fuel cell cars, they are all about the range and the fact that their own lives are so important and busy. They and I quote here, can't waste 5 to 10 hours waiting for a battery car to charge up. That is a quote that I cut and pasted off the Twitters just last week. 5 to 10 hours, this gentleman thinks he's going to be waiting to charge his car. Well, he knows that's not the case, but it's a bit of trolling. Now, the fact that they know nothing or are deliberately obtuse with these old arguments is entirely irrelevant. What is on display now here is a demonstrable fact that many people, when I say people in this context, I'm really talking about men, many men's hesitancy about using battery electric vehicles is psychological, not technological. The technology works. It has drawbacks and advantages like any technology. But one of the things we know from billions of miles of collective experience is battery electric vehicles are cheaper to run, more reliable, easier to use, and more sustainable than the current combustion technology we've all been saddled with. That is just a statement of fact. If it were remotely possible to exchange our entire combustion ground transportation fleet of millions of cars, vans, buses, and trucks to electric power overnight, we'd all be fine. The economy would flourish, the local environment would improve, there would be more better paid jobs and safer jobs in the energy industry, and we'd be richer and have a more stable, flourishing economy. So why would anyone want to start faffing about with a technology equally as old as battery electric, but a technology that just hasn't advanced as much yet? I mean, it may do. It's possible that new technologies and new materials will emerge that start to make the concept of hydrogen fuel cell cars, and again, I underline the word cars, a plausible, economically viable, and equally sustainable method of transport. But the more I think about this, the more I realize it's really not about the actual plausibility of the technology. And this hasn't been the case for a long, long time. I recently read a long and very well-researched article on the desmog blog. I'm going to quote a couple of paragraphs from the article, but the links to it are in the show notes or the descriptions of this episode. Alice Wright is a freelance writer who wrote this very interesting article, who lives in the UK and clearly does proper deep research before she writes her articles. Early on in the piece, she explains that hydrogen fuel, and I quote here, comes in a variety of colours, depending on how it is produced, with almost all hydrogen currently created using fossil gas, and that is termed grey. Blue hydrogen is also derived from natural gas, but combined with the use of carbon capture and storage, CCS, and is being heavily promoted by the gas industry as a bridge to a low emission future. Okay, so there you go. Right at the top, we learn where hydrogen comes from. Right now, it's 98% of it comes from natural gas, the cost of which has just gone up over 400%. So that's not a terribly good start. And the impact of extracting hydrogen from natural gas, which by definition releases huge clouds of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, can be mitigated by using technology that no one anywhere on Earth is successfully using. Yes, folks, I know I've banged on about it before, but carbon capture and storage is a con job. It's a placebo. It's a fiddle. It's a delaying tactic. I would even go as far as to say it is a big, fat, ugly, unpleasant smelling lie. I was momentarily worried that Alice Wright was going to buy this greyish, the greyish colour of fossil fuel lobbying. But thankfully, she went on, and again, I quote, experts dispute this climate-friendly branding, given the problem of methane leakages through the production and transportation process and doubts about the efficacy of CCS. Ah, yes, the efficacy of CCS. Efficacy. That's a good sentence. The efficacy of CCS. It's not a cheap process. In fact, it's so expensive to fight. Despite thousands of claims to the contrary, no one is using this miracle cure for the fossil fuel industry. There is a power station in Canada we'll get to in a minute. A recent study by US academics Robert Howarth and Mark Jacobson from Stanford University in the USA. Now, Mark has been on the Fully Charged Plus podcast. If you haven't heard that one, it's amazing. Go back and find it and listen to it. He's really good. They estimated that carbon emissions from blue hydrogen are only moderately lower than for grey. So grey is where you just release it all into the atmosphere. Blue is where you capture it. Massive inverted commas. The size of Hawaii. Each one, that's how big those inverted commas are. And remember, grey is where they steam reform natural gas, release all the CO2, all the NOx and SOx into the atmosphere. Blue is supposed to be when they capture all the nasty bits for CCS, which, and I forgot this until just recently, Mark Jacobson also studied the only working CCS system in the world and reported that at best it fails to capture over 60% of the harmful elements it's supposed to and uses so much energy to do that, it is a total non-starter. So when you hear a politician saying, well, using CCS, we can get really clean hydrogen, there's no other word for it. He is lying. He is lying. He's telling you a lie. And I've just found a story about what is in effect the world's only carbon capture and storage system, which has been bolted onto an existing coal-burning power plant in Saskatchewan, Canada. It's a joke. It basically doesn't work. They claimed it would capture over 90% of the carbon being emitted by burning millions of tons of coal. It captures around 40% of that. And what is even more depressing is it's not even maintaining the levels of CO2 it's capturing. They captured way less in 2021 than they did in 2020. It's a con job. It's a lie. Oh, and wait, what do they do with the modest amounts of CO2 they do capture? They sell it to an oil company who pumps it underground into underground oil wells to push the oil out. Isn't that just the most wonderfully sustainable system you've ever heard of? Everything is lovely. Don't ask any more questions. Don't look here. We'll paint some flowers on the wall of the power station and you can all sit back and relax. But wait, this is the real kicker when it comes to the 98% of hydrogen we use now. When taking into account the methane that is released to extract hydrogen, its climate footprint is, and I quote again, more than 20% greater than burning natural gas or coal for heat, the researchers found. It's worse. Using hydrogen to heat our homes or to run vehicles is worse than what we're doing now. Worse. It's not better. It's not the same. It's not slightly better. It's worse. So this form of hydrogen is not just a bit bad. It's worse. I'm trying to... And the lying toe bags that spin these stories for the fossil fuel industry get handsomely paid for spreading this guff and would laugh at my criticism because they truly don't care and are, by definition of the term, very unpleasant people. But wait, I hear you wail, you can make hydrogen from splitting water with an electric current coming from renewable energy. Sorry to make it a bit too nasal. It's true. And we did, in fact, demonstrate this very application many years ago on a TV series I used to work on called Scrap Heap Challenge, or Junkyard Wars for American listeners. We put an arc welding torch in a big jar of water and turned it on, producing enough hydrogen to power a big tomato gun. And it worked. Boom! It used rather a lot of electricity, and for every kilowatt hour of energy you use from the hydrogen, usable energy, every kilowatt hour of usable energy of hydrogen made by splitting water with electricity, you have to put in 4 kilowatt hours of electricity. So the argument then is you can use excess electricity from new renewables because it's effectively free and carbon zero. And I like that. That's a very good idea. Until, and I quote, An in-depth article by the website Carbon Brief argues, and I'm quoting here from the article not from Carbon Brief, from desmog blog. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. I'll do it again. So this is a quote from the desmog blog article. An in-depth article by the website Carbon Brief argues that the fuel is unlikely to be taken up universally, particularly as the volume required to satisfy all the possible applications for low-carbon hydrogen would likely far exceed the amount available, even if production is significantly ramped up. We would have to generate 4 times more electricity than we do now to produce all that hydrogen. So we would need to scale up our generating capacity to an enormous extent to split all that water. And, all these technologies improve. It may get as good as 3 kilowatt hours to 1 kilowatt hour, or even 2, but it doesn't get down to 1 ever. There's no way that's going to happen. And again, the reason I say this is you put 1 kilowatt hour into a battery, you use 1 kilowatt hour to drive the car along. The losses are minuscule in comparison. I'm going to quote from the desmog blog again. Because the use of hydrogen increases demand for gas, it basically creates an ongoing investment cycle. And if the people think there is continued demand for gas for the production of hydrogen, then people will keep investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, production and extraction. There you go. There's the key thing. Why is the fossil fuel industry so keen on hydrogen? Because it guarantees that there will be a green leaf motif somewhere saying how clean hydrogen will create a better world for our children. That's what it's all about. We need to be constantly remember that this is just a plain and simple con job. The massive interconnected web of influence and revolving door jobs between the world's governments and the fossil extraction industry guarantees that these multi-billion-dollar companies remain in control for the next 100 years. That's what's really depressing about it. There is no need to ask how hydrogen has gone from being a fairly obscure industry to a critical part of Europe's green plans, as they're now saying. It's because the person who used to be in government now works for the fossil fuel company, or the executive from the fossil fuel company now acts as a government advisor on the nation's energy infrastructure. Our only course of action is to stop buying their as much as we possibly can as individuals. Don't buy petrol, don't buy diesel, don't buy gas for your home. Invest in renewable energy and storage and encourage others to do so. I mean, that is strident, but what else choice have we got? Our governments are completely influenced by the billions of pounds that the lobbying is spent. There's no way I'm going to convince some two-bit, dodgy, bent, corrupt politician, and those are the politicians that rule the country in this country. I'm going to convince them otherwise. They're getting so much money and support and absolute bullshit information from the fossil fuel industry about hydrogen. And if you occasionally run out of arguments as to why fossil fuels are so incredibly bad for us, here's a new angle. The American environmentalist Bill McKibben recently brought up a topic which I cannot believe I hadn't even considered. Listen to this. Around 40% of all international shipping involves moving around fossil fuel. Wait, what? 40% of all international shipping? I mean, that is huge. When you think of the billions of tons of steel, of grain, of iron ore, of timber, and the multiple millions of containers stuffed with all the things we import from Asia, that only makes up 60% of global shipping. The remaining 40% is used to move around coal, oil, gas, wood pellets to burn in renewable power stations. Oh, just let me have a little rant about wood-burning power stations. Jesus, whacked. Sorry, excuse my French. But if you're not sure about it, and this is a UK-specific story that I really know about, Drax B, which is a massive old coal-burning power plant in North Yorkshire on the coast, it has been converted to burn wood pellets. Now, the reason I know about Drax B is in my former life, I spent 2 days filming there when it was still burning coal for a TV series called How Do They Do It? How do they generate enough electricity to run the whole of London, which this one power station does? It is huge. And it burnt billions of tons of coal for many, many decades. And now it's burning wood. And it's so depressing and stupid. So it's been converted to burn wood pellets because that's green energy, yeah? Because it's wood and trees can grow again. So it's carbon neutral because you can regrow the trees that you burn. Seriously, the two-faced tossers that try to spin this pathetic lie expect us, you and me, to be so dumb, so ill-informed and more interested in an epoxy tennis player or someone on a reality show split up from her boyfriend to not understand the exquisite stupidity of this epoxy con job. Draxby receives millions of pounds of taxpayer subsidies. That's money from suckers like you and me to burn imported wood pellets because it's green and sustainable. Seriously, that's how they sell it. And they receive taxpayer money. They are subsidised to do this. What a brilliant con job. They must have walked out of that meeting with whatever poxy, ignorant, dumb, easily conned, bribed energy minister in the government at the time. They must have walked out of their office wetting themselves laughing. I can't believe we got away with that. Draxby receives millions of pounds. Millions of pounds. And the wood pellets are made from virgin forest that's being cut down in the United States of America. And if you're not sure about this story and you're in the UK, check out an episode of Channel 4's Dispatches, which follows the whole sorry saga. It was done by a journalist I know well, and he's really good. I'll post a link to a more recent BBC article about it. It's still happening. Anyway, back to global shipping. Bill McKibben comes to the conclusion that this staggering fact about the impact of fossil fuel transportation is actually good news. Wait a minute, Bill McKibben. Oh my God, Bill McKibben's been nobbled by the fossil fuel industry. What? Well, the idea being that if we reduced the amount of fossil fuels we burn to the absolute minimum, we wouldn't need those massive oil tankers chuntering around our oceans with massive diesel engines that burn the dirtiest fuel humankind has ever produced, bunker fuel. It is literally the at the bottom of the oil barrel. That's what they burn. Quick anecdote. I also filmed on a show called How Do They Do It on one of the biggest container ships in the world. It was in a dock in the UK, and I was talking to the captain as we were filming how they load up all the containers. Amazing. The technology is absolutely extraordinary. The thing is huge. And I said, how many gallons does it use to get this thing moving? Because I could hear the engines starting up. And those engines are huge. If you imagine a row of quite large middle-class terraced houses, that is the kind of scale of the engine. It is just mind-bogglingly enormous. And the captain, lovely guy, said, we don't measure it in gallons, we measure it in tons. It was about 40 tons of bunker fuel to start this ship moving. Now, once it's going, to be fair, it's so enormous, it just kind of keeps going. So they're not burning that much all the time. But to get it to move from the dock out to sea, they use 40 tons of fuel they burn. But so imagine the beneficial impact of reducing the amount of global shipping by 40%. It is truly huge. Anyway, that's a lot of negativity, isn't it? I mean, I've really ranted on too long. Who wants to hear that, even if the actual topics are critically important? What about something to look forward to? Well, I know the entire team at the Fully Charged Show are looking forward to all our live shows this year. There are 3 of them: London, Amsterdam, and San Diego. And isn't that absolutely mad? I'm just going to have a sip of water. Bear with me. From my little Fully Charged mug. Very, very happy with that. Oh, it's nice and cool. There we go. It's lovely. So 3 of them: London, Amsterdam, and San Diego. I never truly expected for the Fully Charged Show to inspire events like the ones we've had. We've done 4 so far, and they have all been truly incredible. So we're definitely looking forward to that. Now, the hyper-observant among you may have noticed I said London, Amsterdam, and San Diego in that order. Amsterdam was going to be in March, but yes, you've guessed it, it's now moved to May. The same location at the RAI in Amsterdam, but it'll be happening in May. The new dates are May the 20th, 21st and 22nd. At the RAI in Amsterdam, the dates for Fully Charged Live UK remain the same. They're at Farnborough International, and that's on the 29th, 30th of April and the 1st of May. Now, I will be flying to the Farnborough event. No, seriously, I'll be arriving by plane. Crazy, I know. It's not a private jet, but it's definitely a plane, and I am quite scared. But the event is going to be amazing. It's going to be this is the UK event I'm talking about. It's going to be nearly twice the size of last year's show. More presentations and talks, way more exhibitors, more amazing tech on display. Of such incredible stuff is coming. Car companies that you might not expect to be there are going to be there in droves, and so many more test drives with so many more cars. It's nothing short of crazy town. And before I go, we did a piece about the energy use of Bitcoin on the Fully Charged show. This is kind of a correction. So like when a dreadful British tabloid slags someone off and then has to post an apology on page 9, right at the bottom. I mentioned how much electricity, it was about Bitcoin and the amount of energy it uses, which is terrifying. But I did mention then how much electricity YouTube uses to deliver literally billions of videos every day. I didn't do my research very well, let's put it like that, and vastly overestimated the actual impact because there's a lot of crazy figures that are bandied about. But I've now found out a much more accurate appraisal of this from the IEA, little known body, the International Energy Authority, who have studied this case very well and produced a peer-reviewed paper about it. So YouTube's consumption is about 0.03% of global electricity generation. That's not that big a figure, is it? But that is all the electricity we generate on our small blue planet. And a single, albeit huge, video streaming service uses that much. It's a lot. I mean, Bitcoin uses massively more per transaction. I just like saying that because for some reason there are some really scary fanatics about Bitcoin that roam the interwebs, and it's fun to upset them and keep them a bit frothing at the mouth, keeps them healthy. And look, this is the very last thing, I promise. A story that made me smile that is connected to this. A video has recently been released of a really rather cool looking 3-wheeled electric car being driven around, i.e. there's been pictures of it as, sort of as a development thing, but there's now some footage of it actually driving. But this car is a little bit different. It's the Dayak Spiritus, and it has been developed by a company called Dayak in Ontario, Canada. And instead of being fitted with vehicle-to-home or vehicle-to-grid capabilities, this one is fitted with vehicle-to-Bitcoin mining capabilities. When you're not driving it, it will either be crypto mining or processing crypto payments. There you go. I've reached peak transition. I think it's fantastic. My work is done. I will say no more. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening.